What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dragon Quest III and its HD-2D remake, to be specific, which released back in November of 2024 while also bringing a few changes to the game with it, not least of which being the HD-2D graphics makeover. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that will cover everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though in the case of Dragon Quest III, as you might imagine, with the original game being quite old, most everything in the game was pretty well known, and in fact there are guides covering basically everything you could imagine for this game already, including some great ones over on Steam that will help you track down the game's major collectibles, and thus that experience is not difficult at all, just so you know. That said, I also need to mention that while this game did in fact release quite some time ago, like 2 months ago, Square Enix did actually provide me a copy of it. The day the game launched, they actually offered a review code for it, but I didn't quite have time for this one, so they just gave me one on launch day, which is why then I'm finally reviewing it now. But still important to mention that is where I got it from. Now, I really wanted to check this game out primarily because the Dragon Quest franchise is very large. It is often considered the grandfather of JRPGs, so there's a fair bit of history there, and honestly, I'm not super familiar with all of it by any stretch, which is why I wanted to take a look at this. With that said though, 3 here is technically speaking a prequel to the first 2 games, all of which together make up what is called the Erdrick trilogy. And it's my understanding, at least according to an end screen in-game, that they plan on actually remaking the first 2 games as well. I would imagine fleshing them out a bit more, as from what I understand they are quite basic compared to anything today. But my point being, this is, if anything, the correct place to start in terms of playing them. But to give a slightly more specific overview, I also just love the HD 2D graphics of games that Square Enix has been putting out lately. I really enjoy that art style, as it really does feel like a sort of modern reimagining of all these games that I used to play largely via handheld devices, which is probably a good place as any to also mention that Dragon Quest III has actually seen a few different releases, such as a version on the Game Boy Color, which I think is important to mention because in spite of that, this remake does in fact offer a few unique things, such as the Monster Wrangler class, which has been in other Dragon Quest games but is new here, a new endgame dungeon, and a variety of other things like allowing you to customize your characters a bit farther. So over the course of this review, I want to talk about what I enjoyed about this game, obviously, which is a great deal of it, but there were a few pain points, and I want to call those out right here at the beginning, primarily being the price and the last few dungeons, including some new content to this remake. So right away, this remake is $60, which is a lot for a game that old, which I think is going to be a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people given just the age and nature of this one. But what's more, talking about the difficulty, another thing I noticed with this game is that any semblance of game balance for both the enemies and your character kind of just completely falls apart in the last few dungeons of the game. So that's kind of what I want to go over here as we move through this review. But starting as always with the technical side of things, how is this game running? It's obviously a port to PC, as this is a PC channel, and I'm happy to say that for the most part it's pretty good. I think the game looks great, again, love the art style. It also plays really well. I think I've seen exactly one mention of a crash for someone, and even the keybinds, which are honestly a little hit or miss with these remakes and ports to PC for Square Enix, are actually really good, no complaints. So it is running quite well, though I do want to take this section to talk a little bit about some localization issues. As with basically every JRPG, there are always, I would say, controversies around the way things are localized, and while honestly most of that just isn't of great interest to me, I did want to point out that in some places the English is a little weird, like the sentences aren't quite correct is what I'm trying to say. They are not so wrong that you can't understand what's being said, mind you, it's just that as someone who is a native English speaker, obviously, that's not exactly how I would have phrased something, that type of stuff, and you can see little things like that throughout this game, and I figured that was probably worth a mention. But from there, let's talk difficulty. One other thing that was added to this particular remake is difficulty options, as opposed to just the one singular one, and that is probably a good thing, as I think towards the end of this one it does take a pretty big nosedive in terms of game balance, especially favoring the new class, the Monster Wrangler. But with that in mind, you can choose between Draki, Dragon, or Draconian Quest, essentially easy, normal, or hard. Now, on the lowest difficulty, your characters cannot die. They can't be brought below 1 health, making it extremely unlikely you would ever actually lose outside of some extremely specific instances. But then we have Dragon Quest, the sort of default normal way to play the game, followed by Draconian Quest. In addition to making enemies stronger, this actually also causes you to earn less experience and less gold, meaning that is a bit more of a grind. That said, you can change this difficulty freely whenever you want, so the game doesn't really hold you to this decision with any consequences or commitment, etc. Now, the other thing I want to talk about for difficulty was the last couple of dungeons that I mentioned, because right towards, I would say, the last 20-ish% of the game, it changes quite a bit because enemies or groups of enemies will suddenly start casting group casts of sleep, paralysis, and instant death on your party. Basically, every dungeon past a certain point, this is what they do. They just spam it at you. Each of those enemies gets to take like 2 to 3 actions per turn most cases, and they will use their roughly 12 to 15 actions on any given turn to spam one of those 3 things at you. And while there are a couple of strategies to work around this, it's a game that goes from a very free-form approach to things like classes and changes, which we'll get into progression-wise, to suddenly being very restrictive in how you approach it because you need to get around things like instant death, especially, in really just a handful of ways. Now, that's actually not my only complaint, though, because on Draconian Quest specifically, I did some of the math on the very late game bosses, like the last few ones. They actually have like some small turn restrictions. It's not like a hard and fast rule, but rather if you want to complete the goal of that fight, typically you have to beat them in under a certain amount of turns. And in order to do that, you basically need to absolutely max damage with the Monster Wrangler on the highest difficulty. This is because the Monster Wranglers tend to be a bit of a boss killer. They have a move called Monster Pile-On, which, if fully upgraded by collecting monsters out in the world, does roughly triple the single target damage of anything else. And the thing is, even with 3 Monster Wranglers on your team, which is the maximum you can have plus your hero character, assuming you weren't trying to heal or keep anyone alive at all, you would need basically the maximum amount of damage every turn in order to hit the health caps of those monsters, in order to hit the turn limit that is required to sort of advance certain things. I'd be very curious to see how well that was tested, if at all, because frankly, while I don't think it's impossible, I do think it would be more down to RNG than it is anything else. Because if you do anything like, miss or simply have to take a turn healing or deal with the boss's effects that actually remove your buffs or put your characters to sleep and have to be, woken up at that point, you're basically just rolling the dice on whether or not this is successful, and I don't particularly find that to be compelling as far as difficulty for various games goes. So while I do want to make it clear it's absolutely not impossible, I also just don't think the late game, especially on Draconian mode, was very well thought out, to be frank, and I just wanted to throw that in here. But luckily, the game makes up for it in other places, and I was having a ton of fun besides just that. So let's talk a little bit more about those things. Starting first with the story setup and my thoughts on it. So in many ways, I would say this is like classic JRPG type stuff, but on the other, they do actually do some really fun things at moments during the story. Like there is part of it where one of your companions, who is typically not going to be like a named or voiced person, just a sort of generic NPC you add to your party, gets used in a main story side quest where you have to build up a town with them, only for them to be overthrown and put in prison, which I thought was really cool. So there's that. But the game starts out with us picking our hero's personality via a personality test, and personalities ultimately decide things like stat growth, though this is also not a permanent choice and can be changed later, so I wouldn't take it too seriously. But after that, we wake up in our house only to find out that we have been summoned to the king's castle, where it is requested that we take up our father's mission, Ortega, who was trying to overthrow the archfiend Baramos, but it has by all accounts failed, and somebody else has to do it or things are going to go south. And thus you set about your task. This initially starts out by just exploring the world's immediate problems, finding a way to the mainland before getting your own boat, before eventually the goddess herself speaks to you, giving you a little bit of direction, such as finding the orbs of life flight, reawakening the Everbird as it's known, giving you access to just flight in general for the world map, in your quest to find and slay the Archfiend. And in many ways, it's a very straightforward hero's tale. But where I think the game is at its best is when it's doing things you don't quite expect, like I mentioned with the Merchant earlier. That's a required main story thing you've got to do in order to collect one of the orbs, and it was a delightful way to, I would say, circumvent how typically games like this don't have a lot of interaction with NPCs that aren't like typically big party members. They don't have a story attached to them, for instance. Well, in this one instance, that actually isn't the case at all. Something happens with one of those party members in a big way. And then the game also has a day-night cycle, and there is a part of the quest that makes pretty good use of that via things like the village of Thaden, which is completely destroyed, and you have to go there at night in order to interact with anybody or the ghosts of those people to learn what you need to learn, while also coming back during the day to do a couple things. So a lot of times the quests, even for the main story, interact with the game's mechanics in fun ways, which is especially fun for stuff like your abilities that are useful outside of combat. Not everything is combat related here. You will get abilities like Safe Passage that allow you to traverse hazardous terrain without actually being hurt. There is an item that can turn your characters invisible for a short while so you can sneak past guards in some cases. And the game had just a whole host of little things like that I wasn't expecting that I think really made the experience a lot better, which definitely made me see why people enjoyed this game so much, as it does really have some great moments in there. And doing all of that while exploring this big, kind of open world map or overworld map if you prefer, without being handed like a specific list of go here, do this thing. In many cases, the game actually tells you to just straight up explore and figure it out, like for finding the orbs as an example. Though to the Remake's credit, they did make this a little bit easier by highlighting the most important stuff on the world map so you don't get entirely lost. But even then, they don't tell you exactly what to do there. So I think the game does strike a good balance of giving you a little bit of a push in the right direction without holding your hand through it either. So all in all, main story-wise, quite good really, more so than I was expecting, which is always nice to see. But let's talk about one of the biggest things this game has going for it, and that is its progression systems. So Dragon Quest III here uses both traditional stuff like, leveling, XP, base stat increases, gear, that kind of thing, gear having various effects on certain enemies, that kind of stuff, but also more interesting things like being able to change your class and vocation, which then affects your stats. And if you level up multiple classes individually before getting to the one you really want, you'll have better stats for it. And then I also want to talk about things like the Sage and the Monster Wrangler, that kind of stuff. So right away, though, we do have our basic level ups. You kill enemies, you get experience. This levels your characters up. As they level, they pick up unique abilities tied to their vocation or their class, at least for your party members. Your hero is just a hero. I will say that with you not being able to change their vocation and the fact of just how overpowered the Monster Wrangler winds up being, your main character starts off great, but they kind of fall off and become primarily your healer through the late game, especially with their Omni Heal, which is a full heal for your entire party, on top of being able to full heal individual characters with the abilities they learn. Now, your main hero also gets a variety of useful stuff like the fast travel spell Zoom, Holy Protection to ward off low-level encounters, and stuff like that. So your hero is useful, but probably not as much of a main character syndrome type thing as you would expect, especially in the late game when their damage really falls off in comparison to other classes. Now, for the rest of your party, the 3 that you can carry with you and any other characters you happen to make but are sent back to the tavern to rest at, you'll simply make these characters or recruit them from a predetermined list. Basically, the game has a spot in the starting town known as Pals. This is where you're going to recruit your other party members. Now, these characters can be any one of the, I would say, base classes, such as a warrior, a mage, a priest, etc. Now, these characters also have personalities and everything, which is, again, important for stat growth, but as a reminder, can still be changed later. But the first thing to probably know, really, is that early on you'll probably want a thief, as they are extremely useful in the early game and pretty much useless in the late game, meaning that when we get to the point where we can switch vocations, we'll probably take someone out of thief and into something more useful once we've got all their abilities on a character. And that's kind of the general thinking you need to have. You probably want to start with the things you want to get out of the way first before transferring those characters to their, I would say, more final professions later on. Now, for some of these professions, that can take a little while because they get their final abilities like in the level 40 range, which is decently high for this game. But regardless of where you start, you're likely going to end with your hero and 3 monster wranglers because they are ridiculous. Now, in addition to these starting classes, however, there is one more, and it's actually a pretty important one to put whoever your caster is in, because that is the Sage. Basically, the Sage can learn all of the mage and priest spells on a single character at the same time, basically. So this makes the Sage really good for learning all of the spells on a single person, or pretty much all of them, which is generally pretty handy. Now, the catch with the Sage is that you can only put someone in that profession or class by finding the Words of Wisdom book, and there's only a couple of those throughout the game until you get to the very end where you'll finally be able to put people into that profession without actually expending the book as a consumable item. Gadabout is basically a clown, and they can do like random buffs on the enemy or you, but can also randomly debuff the enemy or you, which makes them inconsistent at best, which is always the worst type of character. But then the big one I really want to talk about is the Monster Wrangler. So Monster Wranglers start out pretty slow. They're not really good at any one particular thing, but rather they seem to fill the gaps left by other classes, at least in the early parts of the game. For instance, they get early access to a group heal, which takes you much longer to get otherwise. But realistically, their true power has nothing to do with their stats at all. It is actually tied to a monster gathering minigame. You see, once you get past the starter area, you can start wrangling monsters, as it were, and this means you can occasionally find docile monsters about in the world. And if you have a monster wrangler with you, you can just actually catch that monster every single time, whereas without a monster wrangler, you might be able to simply approach it, or you might have to use other classes' abilities to either silence your footsteps or make yourself invisible, like I mentioned, in order to catch them. Now, this is important for the Monster Wrangler because their overall strength, that is to say every single one of them you have, is tied to how many of these monsters you have found. And once you get over 100, that's where things start getting crazy, because of 2 abilities the Monster Wrangler has that nobody else does, and those are Wild Side and Monster Pile-On. So Wild Side will give your Monster Wrangler, the specific one who's using it, 2 actions per turn, though they will just double up on whatever you tell them to do. You can't specify do this and then this, you can only do it once. The thing is, though, the Monster Wrangler's other ability, Monster Pile-On, whose damage is directly tied to all the monsters you have caught, is the highest damage ability against a single target there is in this game. It is not close, to the tune of double or triple most other abilities. Now, against more than one enemy, they will spread out this damage a little bit, so it's not quite as effective, but if you're, just using 3 other Monster Wranglers, it's still going to be enough. And because of the way you get those abilities from, capturing more monsters and the way they scale with the number of monsters caught, your Monster Wranglers don't even need to be a high level to pull this off. You just have to have, been far enough in the game to go catch those individual monsters, which means the end game is really all about stacking these Monster Wranglers and doing everything you can with them, because damage-wise, nothing else even comes close. That said, though, there are a few things to know about the other classes that I mentioned, such as the Merchant's ability to dig up treasure via one of their abilities. The Martial Artist, at their final ability when they get in the level 40s, gets to guarantee a critical against certain enemies, which can be incredibly useful for killing the big experience monsters called metal slimes or liquid metal slimes that are normally extremely resistant to damage. Things like that max level Martial Artist ability can just one-shot them very easily. So every class does have its little benefits, but basically you're going to put these individual characters you recruit through the starter classes you want them to gain abilities from before going to the All Trades Abbey, which you'll discover roughly a third of the way through the game, talking to the, abbot there, who will then give them a ritual to change into a different class, which puts them back at level 1, but only halves their stats, so they get better stats out of this while also retaining all the abilities from their previous class, which means if you've got the time and the patience for the grinding, you can make these guys absolute monsters, which is what you're going to need for some of that draconian stuff, because as I mentioned, it is woefully unbalanced. But given how you can just change the difficulty at any time, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Now that does finally, though, leave us with the gear section of gearing up. Now, truth be told, in-game Monster Wranglers, it's not terribly important. Most of their abilities don't scale off of this stuff, and you'll just want to protect them from incoming damage, which comes down to loading them up with accessories and gear that mitigate a lot of that stuff, because what a given class can wear is actually determined by what class they are. They can't all equip every weapon, they can't all equip every bit of armor, as an example, and some of those bits of armor and weapons, while not technically being the highest attack or defense, for instance, have useful abilities. Some of them have abilities where you can use them as an item in combat, which will then produce a special effect, as an example. And some are just generally more useful because they block or mitigate a certain damage type, which is obviously going to be useful in certain situations. So I would say the gear progression is good overall, primarily because it's not linear, which tends to sometimes be a thing in these JRPGs where gear are just glorified stat sticks, but here they've clearly made an effort to diversify that a little bit, and that's always what I like to see in these games. So overall, progression is interesting. I do think the late game, again, is dominated by the Monster Wrangler, which is new to this game, being wildly overpowered, and it's to the tune of certain bosses clearly being designed around this single class, which is odd because the way the rest of the game works, they never really make a point of doing something like that, which is an odd choice. But then we have the gameplay and world of this one. So as I mentioned, uses the, I would say, pretty standard overworld map system of these games, kind of sort of open world if you want to think of it that way. And there's a lot to do. While the beginning of it is a little linear, once you get a hold of your ship and can start sailing around, the game really opens up. You're given a bunch of different objectives that you can track down whenever. And while they all have to get done, the order in which you do them is largely up to you. And this is going to see you going around to the game's towns or secret spots, exploring individual continents, while also potentially even taking on the optional dungeons the game has, and even finding little side quests of sorts. And a lot of these little interactions make the place feel much more alive than I was expecting, in a way that somewhat surprisingly reminded me of games like Baldur's Gate 1, where it has a certain veneer of believability, and sure, if you scratch under that, it's going to fall apart, but it's just believable enough to be enjoyable. But then we've got other stuff like the game's secret spots. These are just little locations out in the wilderness that will often house monsters you can wrangle or items to be found, and just little stuff like that that aid exploration. The game also uses that day-night cycle that I mentioned, and that matters. Places will change based on whether or not it is day or night. Some things are only available during the day versus the night versus the evening. As an example, you can get spells that will manipulate this for you to make it a little easier, but otherwise you'll have to go rest at an inn to change the time. And while doing all of this, finding out and discovering which character skills are most useful in a given situation, like the zoom ability allowing you to do things like fast travel without having to use an item to do it called a Chimera Wing, or abilities like Padfoot, for instance, that let you ward off low-level encounters without having to use an ability to do so. And you've got a world that is surprisingly interactive for a game this old, or at least the original version being so old. But that's certainly not all. We then have the mini medals, which are little medals you can find scattered throughout the game that if you find enough of, you can bring back to the starting town to get little rewards. And then there are the monster fights themselves. So all those monsters we are wrangling for the Monster Wrangler can in fact be put to use via competitions in some of the towns. We can use the monsters we fought to fight other monsters, sort of Pokemon style, and winning these comes with a whole host of rewards, not least of which though is just straight up cash, which we are going to need to tackle the game's end-game content. So let's talk dungeon design in this particular game. First of all, this game loves its tower dungeons. That's a thing. There's like 5 of them. That is to say, towers you will slowly climb and then you can jump off of certain ledges to fall down to certain points on other floors, that kind of stuff, and most of that is pretty fun. But where the game took a turn for me, as I mentioned, was some of the late game dungeons being monsters using a dozen or so turns to just spam you with group sleep, group paralyze, or instant death abilities, which is obviously very annoying, especially when you get to a place called the Maw of Necrogond, which is likely where you're going to experience this for the first time. And I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem, because honestly at that point you'll have likely just sort of figured out how to manage your MPs to last you until you get back to town, for instance. So once you've got all that mastered, the game throwing a new challenge at you isn't anything crazy. I don't love the way that they did it, mind you, as extremely long dungeons full of these monsters that just completely incapacitate your party every single turn, get real old real fast. It's still doable, but once you finally reach the game's post-game, you can unlock the 2 post-game dungeons, which take this all the way up to 11. Now first, you're going to go through what is kind of generally referred to as heaven in order to fight a boss that will then grant you a wish if you defeat him in a certain amount of turns, which I talked about earlier. One of those wishes that you can get actually leads you to a second post-game dungeon called the Temple of Trials. The Temple of Trials, it is my understanding, actually replaces a different dungeon back in, I believe it was the Game Boy Color version. The Temple of Trials is not fun, and the fact that it's new to this game is disappointing, because whereas the Monster Wrangler winds up being extremely overpowered if you put in the effort to make it so, the rest of that class's kit is clearly designed to fit in with all of the other classes in the game. And despite those problems with the dungeons I've mentioned up to this point, it really does feel like you can mess around with these classes even if there is clearly a best option. The game doesn't restrict you in that way. Well, the Temple of Trials kind of does. So basically what this place is that you have to pass 5 different trials to unlock the game's super boss, which ironically, if you can get to that game's super boss, should be a walk in the park. Now, a couple of these trials are honestly pretty easy in the sense that you basically just have to prove you have done the game's content. This is done in the form of one of them just requiring you to have caught almost all of the monsters. Another trial simply being honestly sort of a money check, where you have to buy a bunch of items and bring it back to the spirit, and then one of those items it will request is going to cost you like 1,000,000 gold if you don't want to spend forever farming it, and that's okay because you can actually do the new monster fights to get that gold pretty easily, which if you've caught all the monsters will be a really easy thing to do. And then a third trial asks you to bring a bunch of legendary items, one of which you actually get from also doing the monster arena fights, so there's kind of some synergy there. And then the others are from doing some side quests which rewards you with unique gear. So far, so good. The problem is the last 2 trials of the 5. These 2 trials require you to move through an area with 2 specific weapon types, and if you're not using those types, you get debuffed into the ground, taking like 10 times normal damage from enemies and dealing 10 times less. Enemies will hit you for like 2,000, and to put that into perspective, your max health is 999. And then just for a laugh at the end of it, they have you fighting the only other enemy in the game that seems to have access to Omni Heal besides your main character, which will cause them to heal their entire party to full, which means unless you have a character with a very specific spell to simply remove these other characters from the battlefield called Blasto, you're probably just not going to win. And that's a problem for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, gear is restricted by class, so if you want to use the weapons to avoid that debuff, your characters have to be in a specific class at that time, which is very likely going to throw apart some of your initial synergies here, because every time you reset your class, that character is taken back down to level 1, even if it's a class they've already been in. So simply put, both of those trials are awful, and they are the icing on the late game unbalanced cake. Which is a shame because I typically find that in post-game stuff, that's kind of where you're having the most fun, you're wrapping everything up, maybe some extra challenges here and there, but man, oh man, the last few dungeons of this game are just a real damper on an otherwise fun experience, and I wanted to call that out in depth. Sure, might not be a big problem for most people, and there is that lower difficulty mode, which makes it to where you can't die, but as an example, that lower difficulty mode is actually not good for those trials. Because you're dealing 10 times less damage, it might actually just put you in a fight that you cannot win, even if you have the right weapons and stuff equipped, because those enemies at the last bit of those trials cast Omni Heal, and if you don't have a character with Blasto, you're still not going to make it, which is infinitely more frustrating than it is fun. But with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about combat here. So, a few notable things right away. You can assign tactics to individual characters in your party, and then just auto-battle your way through everything, though like most instances of this, that works for a lot of regular enemies, but for bosses, you're almost certainly going to have to do things manually. Luckily, there is a battle speed up option no matter what you're choosing here, so you can make the battles move much faster, which I always enjoy, so there's some decent quality of life stuff there. Now, the tricky part is targeting. So a lot of abilities and even just like straight up attacking things, you don't actually get to choose the enemy you're hitting in most cases if it's not actually targeting the entire group of enemies, which even then, depending on their position on the battlefield, you might not even actually hit all of them, which is honestly a little bit frustrating. But realistically, if you've ever played a turn-based JRPG before, you should certainly be good to go. Most of it should feel pretty familiar to you, I would imagine, as otherwise you basically just use your turn to activate either the tactics of an individual character or to manually set what you want them to do via their abilities, spells, or just straight up attack based on the weapon they have equipped. Really not too much to explain there. The one thing I did want to mention, though, is that if you want to use items and stuff in combat, they need to be held by that character. Each character has an inventory, and then your equipment and items can have their own separate inventory if you want. Now, if you want to use an item or a bit of equipment in combat, it needs to be on that character. So if you want to use, say, the revive item, Yggdrasil leaves, you have to put those manually in that character's inventory for them to be accessible. And then from there, it's really just about party comp and whatnot. Now, a couple of just general notes otherwise, though, is that your hero character, again, starts off pretty strong, but falls off about the mid-game in terms of damage compared to other classes and things like the Monster Wrangler. Chances are your main hero is actually going to wind up being your healer because they're pretty good at it, which also makes them a handy character to activate items from their inventory to help keep your other party members in just fighting shape by doing things like making sure that they stay sort of uncrowd controlled to make sure that they can actually hit the enemy on their turn and things like that. But otherwise, learning what each skill or item or ability does and when to use them appropriately and how to set up your team for success is decently enjoyable if you've ever played these types of games before, but it is, I would say, largely just due to the time the game actually came out. Not exactly the craziest implementation of a combat system, but I will say it is still a very accessible way of approaching an older game like this, and I think they did a good job of adding some quality of life there, if anything. Which brings us to the Steam Deck section. Probably not a surprise at all for a game that released on the Game Boy Color at one point, but the Steam Deck runs this game very well. It's verified over there, has all the features you'd want. Realistically, I'd be surprised if you had a problem there, and because of the nature of this game, it might actually be preferable to play it on that particular platform. Really, the only note for it I have is that sometimes, seemingly somewhat randomly, the game might change resolution on you, and you'll have to go in and manually change it to make sure it pops back in to take up the entire Steam Deck screen, but otherwise, honestly, pretty flawless experience. Which brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, again, love the HD-2D graphics. I really enjoy that art style. It is a great way to play older classics, especially because along with the art style just being a little easier to parse, while also looking great, these remakes come with a whole host of other features and accessibility options while also adding a little bit of content that keeps it fresh even if you've played the game previously, but also makes it a great jumping in point for a classic that you might want to experience for yourself in the way that I did. So in that sense, the remake is fantastic. Combine that with bits of the story I talked about, like moments where quests interact with the game's actual mechanics that make it feel like a world in a way you might not expect for a game that was originally quite old, is really impressive. And I think for that reason, this remake is, again, a fantastic way to experience a lot of that for yourself. But on the negative side, we have a few things to mention. First and foremost, the price. I think $60 for this is probably asking a bit much, just period. While I enjoyed this, I don't know that I'd want to pay $60 for it, especially because it is a remake of an extremely old game. And while they did add some, of course, accessibility options, that new class and a little bit of content as a sort of default there, the fact remains that this is still mostly a better looking version of a game that has been out for a long time. And while I think that's worth experiencing, reality is time has sort of marched on nonetheless. And so I just could not see myself paying a full $60 for this. And that's before we even start talking about those late game dungeons I experienced and how I think very unbalanced that last part of the game is, as it plays and feels very different than the rest of it, and you notice that pretty much immediately if you're actually trying to do those things. And that brings me to my conclusion. Basically, on one hand, Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake is a fantastic way to experience an old classic, but it still has some problems I would have liked to have seen cleaned up, and moreover, the price is too high. I would simply wait for a sale on this one, and if you can catch it for around $30, $40, I think you would have a great time at that price. And with that, I think we're going to call this one a review. So hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.